I'm Old Spice, by the way. Or in the context of his talk, Pixie Spice. All of you as children will have heard the story of God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. Haven't you? None of us can have possibly missed that story. The prophet Moses led a vast number of people out into the desert. They were all based upon promises. In fact, they were going to the land of promise, the promised land. What I'd like to do is read to you what the promise was that God gave to the Israelites. And as we started this conference in a chapel, in the home of John Wesley and co., it probably seems appropriate. But I'm sure you're all very familiar with these words anyway, having been brought up properly in Christian homes. This is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8 and verses 7 to 9. It says, "For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, springs out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, honey, where thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt lack nothing." You all know that, you've all heard that before, haven't you, as children, and perhaps as you grew up. All of you went to chapel on Sunday may have heard it then as well. And what was this land called? A land flowing with, gosh, you are good children. A land flowing with milk and honey. It sounds a wonderful land, a bubonic paradise, a bucolic paradise even. That's a fine strip of the tongue, isn't it? A pastoral paradise. When you read it, you can almost hear Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, without the cuckoo, of course. But what I'd like to do is read on to what it then says, because this is less familiar and is rarely quoted. God says, "A land whose stones are of iron, and out of the mountains of which thou shalt mine copper." Okay, so what do we see there? We see a paradise, and not just an agricultural, horticultural, bucolic paradise, but also a land where there'll be mineral extraction, metals. It's true to say that not a civilization in the ancient world, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, every single one of them depended heavily upon metals, upon metal mining. Every one of them had laws pertaining to mining, mineral extraction, controlling them, working them, and benefiting from them. So for thousands of years, since the dawn of history really, mankind has been interested in metal extraction. So the paradise that we all like to think of way back there throughout the earth, where everybody was farmers, everybody was fishermen, everybody worked on the land or in orchards or in vineyards or olive groves, is fine. But it's alongside a very important industry. As I haven't got long to talk, I better be very brief. Where does Cornwall fit into all this? Well, as you probably are aware from the books you've read, archaeology has pushed the history of the metal extraction in Cornwall, tin mining particularly, back nearly 4,000 years to the early Bronze Age. And during every era since then, there has been mineral extraction in Cornwall. Tin, mostly, certainly until the end of the 17th century, tin, and then of course copper and other metals came in. The earliest written reference to the tin industry is quite interesting because at the time that Alexander the Great was kicking 7 barrels out of the Persians, a story again we're all very familiar with, 325 BC, a Greek geographer and explorer and merchant businessman really, left Massilia, which is now called Marseille, in the Mediterranean coast of what is now France, went inland across to the Bay of Biscay and then up to Brittany, what is now Brittany. And then he took ship and he circumnavigated the British Isles. And Professor Barry Cunliffe, I should say, that was the bubonic name, he is described on the basis of his records precisely where he was at any one time. in his description, which was written down 300 years later by Diodorus Siculus, a Roman historian, he described an industry that was well established. He described an industry where the tin ore was located, it was dressed, concentrated, smelted into white tin blocks, and then exported from a port, probably on Mounts Bay, out to France, or Gaul, as it was anciently called. And then there's a 30-day trip into France and then back down the River Rhone to Marseille, or Massilia. And then it was distributed throughout the ancient world. The interesting thing about this description is it describes a well-established business, a well-established trade. Already in the 4th century BC, the inhabitants of Cornwall, I won't call them Cornish because perhaps they weren't, but the inhabitants of Cornwall were already operating a very sophisticated industry of extraction, concentration, smelting, and selling abroad through trade lines that have been already well established. Every era since then has seen the industry continue, and every period since then has also seen improvements in the industry, and innovations, inventions that have made the industry more economic, more profitable, and so on. Now, when I started to think about this talk, I thought I was going to be dealing with the technical developments, but I noticed from some of the preambles and some of the other talks there have been references to the profitability, to the money made, to those wicked outside external people, just referred to the evil investors, the evil capitalists who exploited the poor, downtrodden Cornish miner and eventually Cornish bellmaiden. But I would like to say that that's only partly true. Many years ago, when I interviewed miners who worked in the mines from the end of the 19th century right through to the First World War, they were adamant that as children they only had one ambition: to go mining. Why? Because it was exciting, because they were going to be with their friends, there was camaraderie, and also because of money. They earned twice as much as an agricultural worker. And if you look at the records, look at the cost books, the pay books, over the last 200 or 300 years, you find that miners were actually not as poorly paid as many modern writers like to say. I know it runs against a lot of socialist historians' theory about the exploitation of the poor, but in fact, as in my day, we were far better off, far better paid than those people who were not working in mining. The other thing I'd like to say, and it's an impression that's gained from many books, is that most of the improvements, most of the innovations, most of the inventions in mining came from the miners. They came from the engineers, the men working as engineers, as fitters, as ore dressers, and as smelters. Not from people from the top, as many of the 19th century books imply, either from foreigners coming in and teaching the Cornish how to suck eggs, but or from people who've been away, had a wonderful education, come back and explain how things should be done, but from the men themselves. And I can remember when I worked on 380 level at South Crofty mine, where I spent quite a few of my 30-odd years underground, listening to miners who would approach each other with a better technique for breaking the ground, a better pattern of holes, a better use of the dynamite, using less fuses and so on, to make money, to work faster, to become more efficient. And these were ordinary men. They weren't Neanderthals, as some people imply. They were intelligent men. I'd also like to say, in defence of the impression that many people have of miners, is that the conversation of miners was often very intelligent, and most of them were very well read. I spent some time after finishing history degree at university in the economic history department, and because I then moved over to the postgraduate lot, I was then in the common room listening to conversations and talking to the academics, the highly intelligent, educated people of the realm. And it impressed upon me how more intelligent, more perceptive, often better read some of the people I worked with underground were. And I just thought I'd make this point because there is an impression that us labourers in the underworld, as it were, deep down in the darkness, were just basically labourers, thick, ignorant people who just were able to break rock, but it wasn't quite like that. I'd like to give one example, if I've got time, Right, of the development of the inventiveness of the Cornish miner. Pumping has always been a big problem in mines, getting the water out. And to start off with, there were quite primitive pumps operated manually by men or by horses. And then, of course, water power came in by the 1480s, and Cornish mines then began to use water-powered pumps, first introduced from Hungary. By the 14th century, they had introduced water power into crazing mills. You know the way a corn mill works, by grinding. They were grinding the minerals by using a crazing mill, water-powered. Shortly after this, they introduced water wheel technology to driving bellows for smelting. And then in 1493, we have the first reference to water-powered stamps for the primary crushing of the tin ore. This might not seem particularly impressive until we realise that that was 26 years before the first reference to such things on the continent in Germany. So the Cornish, the people actually doing the job, the workers, were the ones who introduced all these innovations, all these inventions and improvements to the efficiency of their industry. And this has always been the case. With pumps, they moved on to more sophisticated water-powered pumps, to steam engines, first by Sabre, the military engineer, and then by Thomas Newcomen, the atmospheric engine. And then, of course, that Scotsman, James Watt, came along, followed by a host of Cornish miners, mining engineers, I should say, like Richard Trevithick, Arthur Wolfe, William West, the Simses, the Tangys, and many others. And all of them had one thing in common. They'd all been to ordinary schools. Some of them left school at 9 and 10. But they used their brains and their ingenuity and their ability and their natural engineering ability to develop new techniques and new ways of doing things. And as we know, the British Industrial Revolution, which led the world and made this country the most powerful country in the world, was largely led by such technology. At one time, the village of Poole, between Camborne and Woodruff, do you all know it? A paradise, I live there. Yeah. Right next to the heartlands, unfortunately. But the village of Poole at one time was the NASA of Western Europe. People came from Russia, home from America, from Germany, from all over the continent to Poole. Why? Because men like Trevithick, Nicholas Holman, Arthur Wolfe, all these people, that was where they started, that's where they were trained, that's where they developed their skills. And so it became a centre for engineering skill and essential to the successful development of the British Industrial Revolution. I think I've run out of time, so I can't say much more. But what I would like to say is the process continues. And although people at Crofty, there's 40 to 50 men who are working there at the moment, are just doing development work and exploration work. Nevertheless, they are enthusiasts. And as Robin Shale has probably pointed out to you, and you probably met some of them when you went to Crofty on Friday, yesterday, you realise that they are people who are determined to make a success of an industry that is nearly 4,000 years old. Thank you.